1889, just outside Bentrock, Montana. A stretch of land so flat and wide you could watch a thunderstorm all afternoon, never see it reach you. The wind carried the dust and the old ghost sounds of buffalo long since driven off. Grass lay brittle, bent sideways from a winter that refused to let go. Miriam stood with her shawl cinched tight around her ribs, staring at the dry creek bed where the cabin used to be. A fire had taken it. Late January. The stovepipe clattered in the wind and a loose spark must have jumped. It was gone in minutes, and so was her husband. James had been inside patching the cradle for their youngest when the beam fell. He didn't make a sound, just vanished in smoke and orange. Now, weeks later, Miriam stood with her children, 3 of them all bundled, red-faced and coughing from the wind that never let up. Ezra, the oldest at 10, kept his chin high like his father had taught him. Mays, 6, stayed quiet, watching everything as if waiting for it to turn into a lesson. Ruth was the baby, not yet 2. Miriam held her close ribs sore from weeks of carrying milk, dried up voice gone thin from calling into the cold for help that never came. They slept in a lean-to made of old fencing boards and horse blankets tucked against the remains of the barn. Not much of it left. The mare had broken loose the night of the fire and run west. Miriam hadn't seen her since. Neighbors had come by in the early days, left some bread, lard, a pail of beans. Then the silence came, the kind that stretches not just between people but over years. Folks didn't know what to do with a woman left alone with children and nothing but the bones of a house. The land had always been James's dream. He believed in the West like it was scripture, said God favored the hard-headed. Miriam, born in Missouri, raised on hymnals and stitching, had followed him out here with little more than her hope. She remembered the first morning they woke on this land, snow melting on the sill and James whistling as he boiled coffee over a stove he hadn't finished bolting down. Now all that was left was ash. That morning the sky was wide open, pale as bleached denim. No birds, no tracks, just wind moving through the skeleton of what had been their life. Ezra tried to start a fire with wet twigs. He struck the flint until his hands bled. Miriam watched, silent. She couldn't take it from him. A boy trying to become the man he wasn't ready to be. May, shivering beside her, whispered, "Are we gonna go to town?" "There's nothing for us in town," Miriam said. Truth was, she'd already walked the 12 miles to Bentrock once a week after the fire, carrying Ruth in a sling and dragging the others behind her. She'd gone to the church first, found it locked, then to the mercantile where Mr. Halpern gave her half a sack of flour and said nothing. Sheriff wouldn't meet her eyes. No one asked her to stay. Nobody told her to leave either. Just looked past her like the fire had burned her right out of the picture. Back on the land she boiled snow and rationed bread. Every day she thought about packing what little they had and going east. But the road held nothing but more strangers. She knew this land even if it had turned cold and bitter. That night, as the children huddled under a shared quilt, the wind shifted. Miriam smelled smoke, but not the kind from before. This was pine, slow burning clean. She stepped out and scanned the horizon. Far off across the dried pasture, a single light flickered. A lantern swaying, walking. She tensed. Could be a ranch hand. Could be worse. She waited. The figure moved slow, deliberate. As it neared, she saw the shape of a man, tall, lean, dusted with snow and silence. He wore a hat pulled low and a long coat faded at the seams. His boots moved over the dead grass like he knew this land by feel. He stopped about 20 feet from her. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was low, rough, not unkind. She didn't answer. "Your chimney's been black for weeks." Figured something was wrong. Still, she said nothing, just watched him. She could see the outline of a rifle slung over his back and a satchel in his left hand. You alone? He asked. Her eyes shifted to the barn, then back to him. He nodded, understanding more than she'd said. I got stew, he added. Warm bread, too. Brought extra. Miriam stared at the lantern light flickering between them. Her mouth tasted like rust and ash. The baby stirred on her hip. The wind eased for a moment, and in the stillness she could hear the soft clink of the tin pot swinging in his bag. Who are you? She asked. He tilted his head. Just someone who remembers what it's like to be hungry? She didn't trust him. That was plain. But she didn't send him away either. Miriam stood like a fence post in frost-bitten ground, holding her baby close, sizing the man up. He didn't flinch under her stare, just stood still and let the silence settle. Ezra stepped out from the lean to clutching a wooden stick like a rifle. His cheeks were hollow, his shoulders squared with all the courage he could gather. The man gave a slow nod. You must be the boy of the house. Ezra didn't answer. Miriam motioned him back with a slight twitch of her hand, and after a second he obeyed. I can leave the food and go, the man said quiet. Wasn't aiming to intrude. Miriam studied him, the worn boots, the stitched patch on his left sleeve, the way he stood like someone used to riding long distances with no one to talk to. There was a steadiness about him. Not gentleness, but something like it. A man who'd seen hard winters and carried them without complaint. You from town? She asked. He shook his head. My place is north of here, few miles past the ridge. She could picture it, those distant hills dark with pine and shadow. She'd never ventured that far. What's your name? Clay, he said. Clay Reddick. It meant nothing to her, but the way he said it, it sounded real. Miriam opened the barn door wider. The makeshift shelter was barely big enough for the children and what was left of their things. But the fire he built from dry twigs and a stub of pine bark caught quick, filling the space with warmth and the soft welcome scent of food. He stayed outside, back against the wall, letting the heat reach him in thin breaths. Ezra watched him closely, not saying a word. May sat beside the fire with her hands folded in her lap like she was waiting for a hymn to start. Ruth, exhausted, slept against Miriam's chest. The stew was rabbit and potato with bits of onion that still carried flavor. The bread was torn into uneven chunks, rough but fresh. Miriam hadn't tasted salt in weeks. She ate slowly, careful not to seem greedy, though her stomach begged for more. Clay didn't watch them eat. He stared out into the field, eyes tracking some invisible thread across the horizon. You got family? She asked finally. Used to, he said. He didn't offer more, and she didn't press. When the meal was done, Miriam stood and passed the tin pot back to him. Thank you. He took it gently, nodding once. There's more where that came from, if you'll have it. She hesitated. We ain't looking for charity. I know, he said. This ain't charity. It's neighborin'. That word caught her off guard. Neighborin', she hadn't heard it in months. Out here, neighbors meant someone who rode past and didn't steal your chickens. Clay tipped his hat. I'll be back in a day or two if you'll allow it. Ezra's voice came from behind her. We don't need help. Clay looked at the boy, then at Miriam. Maybe not, but sometimes it's still good to have it. Then he walked off, boots crunching soft in the frost, lantern swaying at his side until the dark swallowed him. That night Miriam couldn't sleep. The wind had calmed, but her thoughts did not. She kept seeing the outline of Clay's coat, the quiet way he carried himself, like someone who didn't ask for much, but gave anyway. James had never trusted other men, said people were kind until hunger got hold of them. Then they turned. But Clay didn't look hungry, and yet he looked empty in a different way. The next morning Ezra asked her straight out, You gonna let him come back? She tied her hair back with a worn ribbon. If he brings food, we'll take it. That all. For now. Ezra didn't push it. He just nodded, eyes fixed on the horizon where Clay had disappeared. 2 days later the man came back. Same coat, same calm, a new pot of stew. He didn't come into the barn, just set the bundle down by the door and nodded at Miriam, who stood watching from the shadows. This time she didn't ask his name again. She remembered it, and that frightened her a little more than she expected. The road doesn't end here. Subscribe and move on. The third time Clay came, he brought not just food, but nails, a hand axe, and 2 small bundles of dry pine. Said he figured the lean-to wouldn't last another storm. Miriam didn't argue. He didn't force his help on them. He asked, then waited. Sometimes she said no. Sometimes she said yes. That balance was something she wasn't used to anymore. Since James died, people had either pitied her or ignored her, neither left much room for choosing. Clay stayed that afternoon, mending the low wall where the wind had punched through. Ezra watched him work, arms crossed, trying to understand the man by watching the way he held his tools. Mays stood beside Miriam and whispered questions she didn't answer. Ruth toddled close, curious, falling in the straw and laughing. When the light began to fade, Clay stood and wiped his hands on his trousers. "I'd stay and finish," he said, "but the mare don't like riding at night." Miriam blinked. "What mare?" He whistled once, soft and low. From the dark a pale horse emerged, broad, dappled gray, slow-stepping. It was her horse. Her mare, sweet, with the small white star on her nose, walked right up to the barn, as if she'd never left. Ezra gasped. May's hands flew to her mouth. Miriam felt something catch in her chest and stay there. "Found her near the canyon edge," Clay said, "thin but still strong." Miriam reached out and stroked the mare's nose, her hand trembling. Sweet huffed and leaned into her palm. "Why'd you bring her back?" Miriam asked, voice tight. "She weren't mine." Clay mounted without hurry. "I'll come by end of the week. You need anything, just leave a mark on the fence-top rail west side." And like that he was gone again, disappearing into the cold quiet, the sky hanging heavy with snow. By March, the lean-to had become a cabin again, not much more than 4 standing walls and a roof patched with pitch and oilcloth, but it held. Clay had come and gone, never staying long, never stepping too far in. He brought tools, salt, once even a sack of dried apples. He showed Ezra how to tie knots that would hold a beam fast, and taught Miriam how to notch wood so it'd fit snug without splitting. But he never asked about James. Never asked what they'd lost. He just watched and worked and spoke when needed, and somehow that was easier than kindness. One night after the children had gone quiet, Miriam sat outside on the porch step, arms around her knees. The stars were out sharp and cold, scattered like bones across the sky. Clay sat a few feet away, mending the strap on his saddle. Neither of them said much. The silence between them was not the kind that hurt. She finally asked, "You ever married?" He paused, then gave a soft snort. "Once. Long time back. She died." "No," he said. "She left." Miriam waited, but he didn't say more. She didn't press. She'd learned that silence was sometimes the last thing a man could own. "I never thought I'd be out here alone," she said. James had plans. He always had plans. Clay nodded, eyes on the leather in his hands. "I used to believe that love was something you built like a house, piece by piece. Now I don't know." His hands stopped moving. "Maybe it is," he said. "But houses fall. That don't mean you stop building." The words caught her off guard, not because they were wise, but because they were true. He said them without softness, just stated them like a fact learned the hard way. She turned to him. "Why do you keep coming back?" He looked at her straight on. "Because you didn't fall all the way." The wind picked up again, rustling the dry weeds near the barn. From inside, Ruth gave a soft cry in her sleep, then went quiet again. Neither of them moved. Miriam didn't say thank you. He didn't expect her to, but something settled between them then, not a promise, not even hope. Just the small, quiet beginning of trust. Spring came slow that year. The earth thawed in patches, stubborn as old men. Grass poked through the crust like it wasn't sure it wanted to be alive again. But the days stretched longer, and the wind, though still sharp, no longer bit deep. Miriam had started to speak more. Not much, but enough. Clay came every third day, sometimes with supplies, sometimes with nothing but time. He'd offer to help fix fence posts, patch the roof, fetch water from the well near the ridge. Sometimes Ezra joined him, eager to learn. Sometimes Clay worked alone, quiet as ever. One afternoon, while May and Ruth napped, Miriam helped Clay dig a new trench for the rain runoff. The ground was stubborn, full of stone. She grunted with effort, arms shaking, sweat streaking her neck. "You swing that spade like you've been doing it all your life," he said, pausing to rest. "I ain't had much choice." She leaned on the handle, catching her breath. "When James was alive, I cooked, sewed, raised babies. After he passed, I learned everything else." Clay nodded. "You're doing it? That don't mean I'm not tired." He offered her the canteen. Their hands brushed, just a graze, but her breath caught. Later, as they sat by the fence, watching Ruth toddle barefoot through the new green, Clay asked, "You ever think about leaving?" "Where would I go?" she said. "What would I take?" He waited. "My people back east don't even write anymore. Once they heard James died, I think they buried us too. And I ain't dragging my children across 200 miles of nothing just to be someone's burden." Clay nodded. "This land's hard." "It is," she said. "But it's mine now, whether I want it or not." He didn't argue, just looked at her with that same steady gaze, like he understood the weight of things that stayed even after you tried to set them down. Later that week, he brought a small bag of seeds. Corn, beans, squash. Said he had extras. Said the soil near the southern fence might take if the rains came on time. Miriam knelt to plant them with Ezra and my hands, in the dirt, hair sticking to her cheeks. Clay stood nearby, not helping, just watching, the corner of his mouth twitching like he was holding something back. "What?" she asked. "You look different," he said. She wiped her hands on her apron. "Older, probably." "No," he said. "Stronger." It wasn't a compliment. It was a fact, and something about the way he said it made her chest tighten. They found rhythm. He'd arrive with the sun behind him, cast long over the field. Ezra would run to help with the horse. May would chatter like spring birds. Ruth had started calling him Mr. Clay, her voice soft and curious. Miriam would watch quietly, folding the wash, pretending not to notice how the space around them felt lighter. One day she caught him carving something near the fire. Just a bit of whittling, a habit he had when sitting still too long. She asked what it was. He held it up, a horse small enough to fit in a child's palm, rough but clear. It was for Ruth. He handed it to her without a word. Miriam's throat went tight. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low and the air cooled, they sat side by side on the porch. Ezra was inside, reading a page from the old Bible James had kept by the stove. May and Ruth were asleep. Crickets hummed low in the brush. Clay said, "I thought I'd stay gone for good. Years back." Miriam glanced at him. "Why didn't you?" He took his time before answering. "I was tired of being near things that could break. I figured if I stayed out there long enough, I'd stop missing 'em." "Did it work?" He shifted in his seat. "Then I saw your chimney. Smoke gone. No light. And I thought maybe it ain't just me out here trying to make peace with the past." Miriam looked down at her hands. Her nails were cracked, her palms calloused. She'd never felt less like a woman, and yet something about Clay's voice, his quiet presence beside her, made her feel seen in a way she hadn't since before the fire. The wind stirred the trees. Somewhere a coyote howled. She said, almost whispering, "I'm scared, Clay." He nodded. "Me too." They didn't touch, didn't move closer, but the space between them softened. The first sign of trouble came with boot prints. Ezra found them, 4 sets deep in the soft earth near the creek bed. Too large for Clay, too wide for any of their own. Miriam knelt beside them, heart thudding. The prints were fresh, from the night before, maybe even early morning. Whoever they belonged to had stood watching the cabin for some time before moving back into the trees. That evening when Clay arrived, Miriam told him. He didn't say much, just narrowed his eyes and walked the perimeter, rifle loose in his hand. He came back with a piece of torn cloth snagged on a fence post, worn flannel, sweat stiff. "Drifters?" she asked. "Maybe," he said, quiet. "Could be more." She didn't ask what he meant. She saw the way his shoulders tensed, the way his eyes scanned the tree line even as they spoke. That night he didn't leave. Sat up by the porch with the rifle across his knees. Ezra tried to stay awake with him, but nodded off beside the door blanket over his lap. At sunrise, Clay brewed coffee in a tin over the fire, his voice low when he said, "I know who they are." Miriam waited. "Fell in with some men years back, after my wife left. I wasn't right. Angry. Empty. Thought I could outwalk the pain." He looked down into his cup. "These men, they took things, sometimes more than things. I didn't stop 'em. Not always." He looked up at her. "They remember me. Might think I've got something worth taking now." "You don't," she said too quickly. His eyes stayed on hers. "Don't I?" Miriam swallowed. The children were waking. She heard Ruth stirring in the blankets, May's soft hum as she whispered to her doll. The world hadn't changed, and yet everything had shifted. Clay stood, pulled the rifle strap over his shoulder. "I'll be back by night," he said. "Don't light the fire after sundown. And keep the children inside." "Where are you going?" "To have a word." Miriam stepped forward. "They'll kill you." He nodded once. "They might try." He walked off without looking back. That's how he always left, like a man who never needed a goodbye. Miriam stood still until he disappeared over the ridge, her hands trembling in fists at her sides. The day dragged like a wagon with a broken wheel. Miriam kept the children inside, bread and water and quiet. May asked where Clay had gone. Ezra paced like a penned dog, eyes darting toward the window. Ruth didn't know enough to be afraid, but she stayed close to Miriam, clutching the carved horse in her chubby fingers. By nightfall the wind picked up. The sky was a lid heavy with clouds. No fire. No sound. Just breath and worry. Miriam sat by the door, James's old rifle across her lap. She'd never fired it before. He hadn't let her. Said it wasn't a woman's place. She waited anyway. The first noise came near midnight, hoofbeats. Then voices. 3 of them. Slurred, half laughing, stumbling through the dark like they owned it. Miriam pulled Ezra close, whispered, "Keep Mach and Ruth behind you. No matter what." The door shuddered under a boot. Then again, a voice high and mocking called out, "We're looking for a friend, thought he might be here." Another laugh. "You sure this is the place? Looks like a grave." Miriam stood, rifle shaking in her hands. Then another sound. Fast. Clean. A single shot, not from the porch but from the trees. Then a shout. Then a second shot. Silence. Another voice, low and furious, "Clay, you bastard." Then rustling. Running. Then nothing. The stillness that followed was long and thick. And then, at last, a shape moved toward the porch, limping, coat torn. Clay. Miriam opened the door before he reached it. He was bleeding from the shoulder, face scraped, eyes wild and alert. "They won't be back," he said, breathing hard. "You're hurt," she said, reaching for him. He didn't pull away. "I've been worse," he said. "Come inside." He looked at her, then past her to where the children huddled. "I didn't want to bring this to your door," he said. "I meant to leave it behind." "You didn't," she said. "They brought it. You stood between us and it." For the first time he looked uncertain. Not afraid, just unsure of his place. Miriam stepped closer, her voice steady. "Come inside, Clay." He did. She stitched him up by lamplight. A clean tear across the shoulder, deep but not torn through the bone. Clay sat still, jaw clenched, breath held each time the needle bit. Miriam worked fast, steady, the way she'd once sewn him while the baby cried. Her fingers stained with blood, her sleeves pushed up, hair falling loose across her cheek. He didn't say a word until she tied off the last stitch. "Thank you," he said, hoarse. "You'd have done the same," she answered. He met her eyes. "I already did." They both looked away. Ezra hovered nearby, eyes flicking between the wound and the rifle propped by the door. "They're really gone." "They won't be back," Clay said. "They got what warning they'll get." Miriam rose and washed her hands in a chipped basin. The water turned pink, then red. She didn't flinch. Clay leaned his head back against the wall, eyes fluttering shut for a second. "Should seen it coming sooner." "You did," she said. "You came." He opened his eyes again. "I wasn't sure you'd let me stay." Miriam dried her hands and looked at him, really looked, not like a visitor, not like a man passing through. His coat was worn to threads, his boots cracked from cold, and still he'd fought to protect them like they were his. "You're not just passing through anymore," she said. Something shifted in his face. Not a smile, not quite. But something unguarded. Something soft. May brought over the small wooden horse and tucked it beside his hand. "He missed you," she said. Clay looked at the little figure, then at the girl. "I missed him too." He stayed through the night. Slept by the fire, one arm across his chest, breath shallow with pain. Miriam sat nearby, legs pulled to her chest, listening to the crackle of the logs and the low hum of wind against the wall. The children were asleep again, bundled tight in blankets, their dreams undisturbed. In the hush of early morning, before the light changed the color of the walls, she said almost to herself, "I don't know what I'm doing." Clay didn't open his eyes. "No one does. I keep thinking I have to be strong all the time, that if I fall apart it'll all come down around me." He turned his head toward her, eyes still closed. "It won't. You don't know that." "I know you," he said. She was quiet for a long while. "Then I didn't want to need anyone again." "You don't," he said. "You're choosing." She nodded slowly, as if to herself, then rose, pulled the blanket over his chest, and whispered, "Rest. I'll keep watch." By late spring, the cabin looked like a home again. Clay stayed. Not every night, not always close. But his presence became part of the rhythm. He helped Ezra build a fence for the new goat he'd traded for. He showed May how to tie braids in rope, and Ruth how to hold a paintbrush. They painted a sun on the barn door, crooked, bright, hopeful. Miriam smiled more. Not wide, not often, but real. One warm evening they sat on the porch again, watching the sky burn with color. "I thought I'd be buried here," she said, arms wrapped around her knees. "Alone, cold, forgotten." Clay sipped from his tin cup. "You still might," he said. She turned, startled, then saw the flicker of a grin on his face. She laughed. The sound surprised them both. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled something out, small, wrapped in cloth. She unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a simple ring, brass, a little dented but warm from his hand. "I ain't a man with much," he said, "and I can't promise peace or ease. But I'll stand beside you if you'll have me." Miriam looked at the ring, then at him. "I don't need peace," she said. "I need someone who won't run when it gets hard." "I already didn't," he said. She smiled, eyes wet. "No promises," she said. "Just one day at a time." He nodded. "That's all I know how to give." She took his hand and slipped the ring on. It fit. The summer bloomed hard and fast, wildflowers bursting through the cracked soil, bees thick in the clover sun, climbing early and holding on late. The land, so long a place of grief and ash, softened. It didn't forget, but it forgave in small ways. Clay moved in slow, not all at once. First it was a pair of boots by the door, then his coat hung beside Miriam's shawl, then a drawer, then a bedroll tucked near the stove. The children adjusted without question, as though he'd always been part of the house. Ruth began calling him Pa one morning, unprompted. Clay looked at Miriam with surprise, but she only nodded. "Let her," she said. "It's hers to give." He built them a table with his own hands, smoothed the edges so no child would catch a splinter. He planted rows of corn in the back plot, humming as he worked. When the first green shoots came, he knelt beside them like a man in church. They made a life slow and careful, built from the ground up like a fence post set in stone. But life, as it does, brought trouble again. One letter came in early August, sealed in wax, thick and creased, carried by a merchant headed west. Miriam read it twice. Her brother's name at the top. Missouri. 4 years since he'd written. Now he was offering a place, a house schooling for the children. Said she could leave the hard life behind. Said she didn't have to marry a stranger to survive. She folded the letter and didn't speak of it for 2 days. Clay noticed. Of course he did. "You've been somewhere else," he said one evening as they shelled peas by lantern light. She didn't answer right away. Then she handed him the letter. He read it once, slow. His eyes stayed on the paper a while, even after he'd finished. "You thinkin' of goin'?" She didn't know what to say. She wanted to be honest, but the words tangled up. "I think about it," she said. "I think about not struggling for every bite. About the children having shoes that fit and books to hold." He nodded. "I don't want to be a fool," she added. "Don't want to say no to something just because it's not what I pictured. You'd be safer there. Maybe." They sat quiet again. The lantern hissed low. He finally said, "You wouldn't owe me anything if you left. You know that." She looked at him, then really looked. At the man who had stood outside their grief until he was invited in, who never pushed, only offered, who had risked his life for children that weren't his, who had built a table by hand and made room for her silence. "I do know," she said. The next morning she saddled Sweet and rode to the ridge. Alone, she carried the letter in her pocket, sat under the pine where Clay had once watched the valley. The wind moved through the branches like breath. She thought about Missouri, about lace curtains and flat fields and Sundays in starched clothes. She thought about what kind of woman she'd have to become to live there again, quiet, obedient, small. She thought about Clay's hands, rough and careful, about Ezra's laugh when Clay lifted him onto the mare, about Ruth's sleepy head on his shoulder, about May's singing to her doll in the garden they'd planted together. When she came home, Clay was in the field with Ezra fixing the gate. He didn't ask her anything. She walked straight up to him, dirt on her hem, letter in her hand. "I burned it," she said. He looked at her, jaw tight. "I don't want safety," she said. "I want truth. And I want the life we've made, even if it's hard." He blinked once, slowly. "Then we stay," he said. That night they didn't talk about it again. They didn't need to. She curled against him by the fire, and he wrapped his arm around her like it belonged there. Outside, the wind carried the scent of ripe grass and smoke from a neighboring field. A harvest was coming. So was autumn. And still they stayed. Autumn arrived quiet, without fanfare. The leaves turned slow, like they weren't sure they trusted the change. The mornings came sharp with cold. Frost clung to the windows before the sun had a chance to melt it. The fields dried to gold, and the children ran through them with their arms stretched wide, chasing nothing in particular. Clay built a woodpile high enough to last the season. Miriam canned everything she could: pickled beets, wild berry preserves, jars of tomatoes fat with sunlight. They worked together in a kind of practiced silence, comfortable, unhurried. Her hands brushed his often. Neither pulled away. One morning she found Clay sitting at the edge of the field, Ruth asleep in his lap, mate at his side, braiding bits of dry grass. "You ever think about starting over?" he asked, not looking at her, "not just from what you lost, but from what you never had?" She knelt beside him. "I think we already did." He nodded. Ruth shifted in her sleep, sighed once, then went still again. "I used to think I wasn't meant to be anyone's anything," he said. "I left people before they could leave me. That was easier." "You didn't leave us." "No," he said, looking at her. "You didn't let me." They got married under the bare oak near the southern fence. Just them and the children. No preacher, no vows beyond what was spoken plainly between two people who'd already made their promises in quieter ways. Ezra stood tall beside Clay, proud in a hand-stitched shirt. May wore a crown of late blooms. Ruth clutched a crust of bread and beamed at everyone like she knew something important was happening. Miriam wore her hair, braided and pinned with her mother's combs. No white dress. Just the one she'd sewn the winter before, strong, clean, and simple. Clay looked at her like she was sunlight breaking after a long storm. They exchanged rings. His carved from bone, hers polished brass, the same one he'd given her months ago. It hadn't tarnished. No one clapped. No music played. Just wind in the grass and the sounds of home, a horse snickering, chickens fussing, a stove door creaking open. Later, Clay lifted Ruth onto his shoulders and spun her slow in the field. Ezra held the rifle he'd been given, James's old one, oiled and clean. He didn't carry it with the weight of fear, but with the pride of a young man trusted to protect. May danced barefoot in the dust, humming to herself. Miriam stood near the porch, hands on her hips, watching them all with a look Clay had never seen before. Not happiness exactly, but something stronger. Peace, earned the hard way. That night, after the children were asleep, Clay lit a lantern and brought her outside. The stars were scattered bright, the air dry and still. He led her to the barn. Inside, against the far wall, stood a rocking chair. He had carved it over weeks, piece by piece, when she thought he was out hunting. The arms were smooth. The back curved just right. Along the top edge he'd carved their initials, small, quiet letters that didn't ask to be noticed. She touched the wood, then turned to him. "Clay, you need a place to sit," he said, shrugging. "And rest. After everything." She sat. It creaked once, then held steady. She rocked slow. He stood beside her, hands in his pockets. "You made this for me." "I made it for the life we built," he said. "But, yeah, you too." She reached for his hand, pulled him down beside her, the two of them rocking in silence, breathing the same rhythm. After a while she said, "I think I'm with child." His breath caught. "You sure?" "Not yet," she said. "But I felt it. That old pull in my bones. Like something's coming." He looked at her, searching her face. "Are you afraid?" She shook her head. "Not anymore." He rested his hand over hers where it lay across her stomach. "Whatever comes," he said, "we meet it together." The stars above them didn't blink. The world turned just the same. But something had rooted deep in that soil, not just crops, not just shelter. Love, quiet and sure, like a seed finally breaking open. The first snow fell early. Just a dusting at first, like flour on a breadboard, soft across the roof and fence rails. Miriam stood in the doorway, shawl pulled close, watching it gather in the corners of the yard. Clay was out in the barn splitting wood. She could hear the rhythm of the axe, steady, clean, the sound of a man making room for winter. Inside, the children sat near the fire. May threaded dried apples onto a string for the pantry. Ezra patched the elbow of his coat without being asked. Ruth napped in the old rocking chair, now her favorite place in the house. The days were short, but they were full. Clay had started a new fence line, said he wanted to run cattle come spring if they could manage it. Miriam didn't argue. They had built a life on what used to feel impossible. Another mouth to feed wouldn't break them. She hadn't said the words aloud yet, but he knew. The way he touched her stomach now and then, gentle, almost reverent, he knew. They didn't talk about the child much. Didn't need to. It was coming like everything else had, slowly, then all at once. That morning, Clay came in shaking snow from his shoulders. "Ground's startin' to freeze," he said. "Won't get much more work done out there." She handed him a cup of broth. He stood beside her, warming his hands on the tin. "You think we'll have enough?" she asked. "For winter?" "For all of it." He looked around at the fire, the shelves stocked with jars, the children working quiet and sure, the walls that no longer shook with wind. "I do," he said. They didn't plan a celebration, but neighbors began to arrive in ones and twos. Word had traveled slow as smoke about the woman who'd survived the fire, about the man who came back from nowhere, about the family that stayed when others left. Someone brought a quilt for the baby. Another left a basket of eggs. A bottle of whiskey appeared on the porch with a note that simply said, "You made it." They drank coffee that night, strong and black, and watched the snow fall in earnest. The fire popped in the hearth, and Clay pulled Miriam close as the children drifted to sleep beside them. "I don't think I ever knew what home was," he said. She leaned into him, hand resting over his heart. "I don't think I did either." Outside, the snow deepened, covered the old burn marks near the barn, softened the scars in the soil, hid the broken places that once marked everything they'd lost. And when dawn came, pale and hushed, the cabin stood solid, smoke curling from the chimney, footsteps in the snow leading out and back again. A ring sat on Miriam's finger, worn and warm. A baby grew quiet and steady. The rocking chair creaked gently in the corner. And Clay, once a man who'd wandered without a place to land, now slept with one arm across her hip, the other curled around Ruth, who'd climbed into their bed before the sun rose. They had no map for what came next, but they had each other, and that was enough. If the land felt alive, subscribe and keep listening.